Hello,
Yeah.
everyone. I'm back with the most knowledgeable doctor, an ever-growing body of knowledge. I guess not literally, metaphorically. Dr. Peter Rogers is back again. We're going to talk about dementia. We're going to talk about cognitive decline and what you can do to optimize your brain health. He's got a whole book out there on this topic, and we'll also get into his own theory of dementia, which will have your brain making new connections. And I honestly think it's the most impressive discovery that Dr. Peter Rogers has made in his search of the literature. So, Peter, you're a radiologist. You see tons of brain scans. So the first question, what drove you to radiology and studying cognitive health?
Well, sort of, I did a surgical internship, but I had decided to go into radiology because I knew I was really smart. I was considering going into cardiology, orthopedic surgery, or radiology and becoming an imaging guided surgeon. I was first in my class. I was like one of the best medical students in the whole United States, probably the best one. So I said to myself, I want to do something where I challenge my brain, where I keep a wide range of knowledge because people joke about ortho. The mentality of ortho is bone broke, must fix. Okay. Binary decision making. So I figured it wouldn't be much use of my brain. And so that's how I ended up in radiology with the goal of going into imaging guided surgery. What that means is, in order to do a procedure with imaging guided surgery, you have to interpret a CAT scan, MRI, whatever, and then you have to operate on the patient. So it requires a combination of knowledge. That's why I went into it. But there were multiple reasons why I kind of drifted away from that, and I switched to becoming a neuroradiologist because I was most fascinated by the brain. And I actually had done half of the training to become an imaging guided endovascular neurosurgeon, a brain surgeon. But what happened was that, the logistics of it, there's turf issues, and basically neurosurgery taking over the referrals for endovascular brain surgery. So what that meant is the radiology backed people would get lousy cases. So anyways, that's why I decided not to go endovascular brain surgery, and it just became a diagnostic neuroradiologist. I still do some procedures. I ran a spine clinic and stuff for a while, and I still do general radiology. I love this nutrition telehealth because it's the most powerful thing in the world for health, but there's no money in it for me. And so I just do it as a hobby because I know it's good and I find it fascinating.
I have a close friend, or a best friend, I guess, that is doing his residency in radiology right now, and it's very similar to what drove him to the career. Was he did his upper year practicums, and everything else was, even like emerge, he said it gets a little repetitive, and this was the only thing that had enough variety in it for him at least, and let him exercise those problem-solving muscles. All right, let's get into today's topic. What exactly is dementia? Can you explain the different types, Alzheimer's, vascular, Lewy body, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so basically, a person will have normal cognitive function as they go through their youth and their early middle age, so to speak. But a lot of people then have progressive cognitive decline. And there's different degrees of severity. Initially, they just forget names and words and things. And some of that is normal with aging because, you learn so much more as you get older that some of the old information, in a sense, gets obscured. It's like you're piling up a bunch of dirty clothes in your bedroom and it's harder to find something because it's under a pile of stuff. But you do see demonstrative cognitive slowing in people as they get older. As a matter of fact, I can tell you, I got internal medicine friends, and they tell me every single one of their patients is cognitively slow by the age of 60. And what's happening in the Western world is people are eating high-fat diets, and they're plugging up their arteries. So, everything in the body works better when it has good blood flow. You plug up the arteries to the brain, things stop working. And people become, they still know how to find their way home, but they've lost their nuance, their vitality, that spark. And so you don't want that to happen to yourself. Then the next thing is that this whole Alzheimer's thing is nonsense, by the way. If you ask any neurologist, any internal medicine doctor, they'll go, Alzheimer's is the most common cause of dementia. But that's actually a stupid thing to say. And here's why. If you were to question a patient, on the history of their evaluation, what question could you ask them to confirm dementia, to confirm Alzheimer's? There is none. What physical exam? Can you put the stethoscope on them and diagnose Alzheimer's? No, there is no diagnostic physical exam finding for Alzheimer's. Then you say, well, what about imaging? Parietal temporal atrophy, isn't that characteristic of Alzheimer's? I've seen tens of thousands of brains. I hardly ever see that. That's BS, okay? Then they'll say, well, what about, the nuclear medicine test for beta amyloid accumulation? It's not that specific. It's not that reliable. You will sometimes have elevated beta amyloid in people who don't have Alzheimer's, and then you won't have it in the ones that you think do have it. And then you go, well, of course at autopsy. Autopsy is pathognomonic. You can have extracellular senile plaques, intracellular neurofibrillary tangles. No, it's not. You can see vice versa again. The patient that appeared to have Alzheimer's not have it in the one that you think doesn't have it does have it. What I'm saying is you can't reliably even diagnose it at autopsy. And then what about treatment to prevent it with the drugs they have for Alzheimer's? They don't work. They often make the patient sicker. So if you have a disease that you cannot diagnose and you cannot treat, what do you call that? You call that BS. You call that nonsense, all right? And then why does nonsense persist? Because there's a lot of money in it. You match the ill to the pill, send a bill, you get the patient hooked on drugs, you pick their pocket every day, you milk them like a cow. Okay, so what I'm saying is, wouldn't it be nice if there was something useful that we knew about dementia that patients could understand and they could use that information to help protect themselves? And I'm going to tell you that yes, there is. The first and best theory to understand about Alzheimer's, about not Alzheimer's, I don't even want to use that word, dementia, is to understand the Jack de la Torre theory. Okay, Jack de la Torre theory is a PhD out in Texas. He would tie off the carotid artery in a mouse. And then he was expecting the patient to have a big stroke on that side of the brain, but they didn't stroke. The middle-aged and older mice would become demented in about 2 months. And when he did an autopsy on their brain, there was no stroke, but the side of the brain where he tied off the carotid, it was shrunken. That's called atrophy. So same side atrophy. And what happened? They lose brain cells by what's called apoptosis, a gradual loss of brain cells because they don't have enough oxygen and glucose being delivered because of the lack of blood supply. So they gradually die when they can't meet their metabolic demands. And he did a lot of stuff. He tied off both carotids, tied off the verts, tied off the middle cerebral artery in the brain. That's called the Jack de la Torre theory of vascular hypoperfusion. It's also called the vascular hypothesis of dementia. And so when you first hear that, you say, oh, well, that's nice, but, not that many people have a severely stenosed or occluded carotid. Whoop-de-doo, big deal. Why should we care? Well, guess what? A lot of people have atrial fibrillation where they lose about 25% of atrial filling, so they get less blood supply to the brain. So I call these mouse equivalents. They're like the mouse, hypoperfusion of the brain. Perfusion means blood flow delivery. Okay, what else? A lot of people got congestive heart failure, decreased pumping pressure in the brain. Well, guess what? They're like the mouse. That's a mouse equivalent. Lots of people got aortic stenosis, aortic regurgitation. That's the aortic valve of the heart disease. So they don't get enough blood to the brain. They're like the mouse. Okay. And we got even more common stuff than that. Over time, chronic hypertension and diabetes will damage the small arteries in the brain. And the person will develop intracranial atherosclerosis, which decreases oxygen delivery to the tissues. So that also is like a mouse equivalent. So that's an important point. Untreated, poorly treated, severe hypertension or diabetes damages blood vessels in the brain, intracranial atherosclerosis, okay? But now you're still saying, well, still, is that really that common? And I got another one for you. Why do you have a blood pressure? Because you want to get blood to the top of your brain, your cerebral cortex on the top of your brain. You got to pump that blood against gravity. Well, guess what? You talk to McDougall, for example. McDougall will say, I don't like treating hypertension unless their systolic's over 160, okay? Other people say, oh, no, you should treat when the systolic's over 150. And then the drug companies are like, oh, we think you should treat when it's at 140. Some people even say lower. So what I'm getting at is the lower the threshold to treat with medications for hypertension, the more patients you can treat, the more people you can get hooked on drugs. So there's a lot of pressure always from the big name universities, the Ivy League places, through the drug company. So if a doc works at an Ivy League place, he's got to kiss the butt of the drug company in order to get grant money so he can do research, and he's got to publish a paper that makes the drugs look good. Because if he makes the drug looks good, he comes knocking on the door the next year and says, hey, can you give me some more grant money? The drug company says, yeah, sure. You want to go on vacation to Florida, take your whole family, have fun? Here's some more money. He's like, yes. Okay. So as long as he promotes those drugs, he's making money. He's getting promoted. His wife is happy. Everything's good for him. But it's not so good for the patient. So what I'm saying is the more they lower that threshold, the more hypertension's overtreated. So you take somebody who had a baseline blood pressure to their brain of 170 and you drop that to 120. What do you think's happening to the top of their brain? It's hypoperfused. It's like the mouse. It's a mouse equivalent. Get it? They're underperfusing their brain, not getting enough oxygen and glucose through blood flow delivered to the brain, so they're at risk to go in apoptosis and become stupid. Believe me, that's real common. It's a real common reason why old people fall. All day long, I see these requisitions. Old guy fell, hit head. Old guy fell, hit head. BHT, blunt head trauma. Old guy fell, hit head on blood thinners. It happens all day long. They're overtreated hypertensive. They're falling and smacking their heads. And, a young guy falls and puts his hands out. He's okay. The old guy's too much blood pressure medicine. Oh, bam, smack the head. Okay, so anyways, that is vascular hypoperfusion theory of dementia. That's number one. Okay. Number two theory of dementia is let's call it the Calpain Cathepsin theory of lipid peroxidation. This is Tetsumori Yamashima, the Japanese guy. He's like one of the head editors of the Dementia Journal. And he was a neuroscientist in Japan. He's given the task of how come so many Japanese people are becoming demented? There didn't used to be that many. They did have a lot of strokes back in the 1960s and 70s because they're smoking cigarettes like a chimney. They're eating 12 to 14 grams a day of sodium. Okay, so they were hypertensive because of that. But they still were relatively healthy. You had a lot of long-lived Japanese. But nowadays, more and more of them are fat, sick, and stupid and demented like Americans. So what happened? And he studied them. He came to conclusions because they're putting a lot more oil on their food, eating a lot more fried food. And that causes a cascade of reactions, including lipid peroxidation, production of toxic aldehydes like hydroxynonenal, and that damages the heat shock proteins, heat shock protein 70, and it leads to this series of problems where heat shock proteins damage, and then something called Calpain becomes activated, and it destroys the cells. All right, so what I'm trying to say is that's the omega-6 theory of, and the reason that's actually highly relevant. So you're thinking, okay, a bunch of Japanese people demented, so what? Well, guess what? That's actually the secret why people in India are sick too. And here's why. Because he started doing tests where he did all these tests on different types of animals, and he found that the same thing that's destroying brain cells in the Japanese is destroying pancreas cells in everybody around the world that eats a lot of fried food. Because I wonder why all these relatively healthy looking Indian people were having diabetes and coronary artery disease. I have a friend, he's like this skinny, he had a myocardial infarction, had to be defibrillated. And I said, well, what is it? You're a vegetarian and you walk all the time. He's a physician. He's a pretty healthy looking guy because I hadn't seen him in a couple of months. I said, what's going on? I haven't seen you in a while. And he goes, I was dead. I go, what do you mean you were dead? He goes, I was dead and I had to be defibrillated. And I said, how could that happen? I thought you were a vegetarian. You're always exercising. And he goes, I am. And I said, let me guess. I said, do you put oil on your food? He goes, well, you have to cook. I go, no, you don't. Okay. And that's what it was. So anyways, so what I'm getting is that high amounts of fried food that causes loss of the pancreatic beta cells, and that'll lead to type 1.5 diabetes. That's why a lot of those persons with diabetes are skinny, because type 1.5, they can still be skinny. It can be similar to type 1. It's almost like late onset autoimmune disease. Okay, so that's big to know. And in addition, that can also cause damage to the cells in the arcuate nucleus of the brain, the hypothalamus hunger center, and that can lead to problems with obesity, a loss of self-control, appetite control when you damage those cells. So that's another interesting thing. So anyways, that's the omega-6 cooking oil theory of dementia. Okay, now the next one I want to tell you about is my own theory. And my own theory is what you would call the supply and demand theory, or the neurovascular uncoupling theory. I'd like to show a couple slides though, because I think it'll help people to make sense of all this.
Yeah, let's do it. By the way, I was smiling earlier because I'm thinking of these questions and you're just asking yourself, I'm like, oh yeah, just let him interview himself here. Can we step back for just a brief moment?
Sure.
Just because people might be, I don't know, or have loved ones in these situations. I was wondering about cognitive tests and whatnot. Is there like a way to reliably measure someone's cognitive decline using?
Yeah, they can do that. They can do they've got a bunch of quick tests where they just ask you a couple questions and, can you subtract backwards from 100 serial sevens? And they'll do other types of testing, but, the family knows, can you balance your checkbook? Can you find your way home? Are you able to do your job? Are you able to cook for yourself? They start forgetting things. Like when my mom had brain metastases from cancer, she left the car running in the driveway. She'd never done that, in her whole life.
So you talked about the two of the, I guess you could say, prominent major theories out there for dementia, or at least two big reasons why people get cognitive decline. Do you see this, I guess, in patients on brain scans? Like, do you see different patterns on brain scans? The
main thing I see on brain scans is an atrophic brain, a shrunken brain, kind of like what the Jack Della Torre theory would predict. I mean, I've seen tons of strokes, but most of the time, my demented patients, they got atrophic shrunken brains. That's the main thing.
And how well do the scans correlate with cognitive functioning too? I guess
not that great, reasonably well.
Okay.
Like I'll give you one story. I have a lady friend, neuroradiologist, and she had done some of her residency in a big city, actually in the Chicago area, where she rotated through a hospital right next to Chinatown. Okay, the Chinatown had a lot of old Asian people, Chinese people eating the old-fashioned rice diet, and she remembered her senior attending saying, "Look at these Chinese brains. They look so good. How do these brains look so good?" And when somebody says a brain looks good, what you're really saying is the brain's tight. What a tight brain means is the brain is filling up the space of the skull and it's touching just about almost touching the inside of the skull circumferentially. versus an atrophic brain is shrunken down away from the skull, and there's all this cerebrospinal fluid that fills in the gap. And it's because of eating a starch diet.
Exactly. Introduce us to your theory of neurovascular uncoupling. Let's see.
Okay, this is a neuron. A neuron is another word for brain cell. And here is the cell body. The cell body of the neuron is sort of the sensory component of the neuron. Here's the nucleus where the DNA is located. These are mitochondria that make ATP for energy. These little branching parts here that look like a tree, those are called dendrites. You know, the Latin root for tree is dendron, so these are dendrites. And those receive incoming information. The neuron takes the incoming information, and if enough information comes in, it becomes activated. Then an action potential would be initiated. Right about here, it's called the axon hillock. These are sodium channels that let in positively charged ions of sodium, and this will create like an electrical impulse called an action potential that's transmitted down the axon, this long shaft connecting the cell body part to the axon terminal is called the axon. The action potential travels down to the axon terminal, and this electrical charge of sodium ions entering activates what is called VGCC. VG stands for voltage gated because of the charge change made by the sodium channel activation opening. And that activates this calcium channel, voltage gated calcium channel. This lets calcium come into the cell. The concentration of calcium out here is very high. It's about 10,000 times higher than it is in the center of the cell, the cytoplasm of the cell. Once calcium concentration is high in the cytoplasm, it causes these neurotransmitter vesicles. They're like membrane enclosed vesicles containing NT for neurotransmitter. And these then diffuse to the synaptic cleft, the plasma membrane here. Synaptic cleft is the space between the sending neuron, the presynaptic neuron, and the recipient neuron, the postsynaptic neuron. The neurotransmitter will then diffuse across the synaptic cleft, and it will bind to a receptor on the postsynaptic neuron, and it will activate it to create some type of response. So that's how neurons work. That's how they send a message, through a neurotransmitter. Okay, and I also want to show you just briefly what blood supply is all about. So here's a capillary in the brain. These are the red blood cells. They're traveling in this direction along these arrows. They're typically a little bigger than the capillary, about 7 microns in diameter. Capillary is about 5 microns in diameter, so they have to fold back on themselves a little bit. And as they travel through the capillary, they give off these little blue circles, which are oxygen. So the oxygen travels across. The yellow thing is the capillary basement membrane. The green is the vascular smooth muscle. And then the blue circles of oxygen go to the axon, and they provide it with oxygen, which is needed to make energy. The mitochondria use the oxygen to make ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. It's what the chemical nature of energy in a cell. And I show you this for comparison, that if you have chronic hypertension and diabetes, the wall of the artery of the capillary becomes thickened. So this capillary basement membrane, the yellow here, becomes thickened. Look how thick this is compared to this. The smooth muscle, vascular smooth muscle, becomes hypertrophied. So look how thick this is compared to this. You'll also get hypertrophy of ligaments in here. So, well, ligament-like tissue. Let's just call it collagen, connective tissue. So what I'm saying is,
Peter, is part of that is part of that thickening because of loss of elastic tissue?
In the bigger arteries, yes.
Okay.
In these arteries, it's especially, hypertrophy of the basement membrane, hypertrophy of the smooth muscle, hypertrophy of the connective tissue, the collagen. And so less oxygen, I got less blue circles coming in this way, are able to get to the axon. So the worse this gets, the diabetes and the hypertension, over time, the less oxygen is being delivered to these neurons. Okay, here's a little bit more detail about how a synapse works. Glutamate neurotransmitter merges with the plasma membrane of the presynaptic neuron, and then the glutamate is released in the synaptic cleft. It diffuses across, binds on a receptor of the postsynaptic neuron, and then it opens up sodium channels on the postsynaptic neuron. These will cause a discharge. They'll cause a depolarization. The charge will become more positive because positively charged sodiums are coming in. And then that will activate this channel over here. It's a calcium channel that also binds glutamate and lets calcium into the cell. And now once calcium comes in, this gets activated. The postsynaptic neuron gets activated, okay? So a normal amount of glutamate activating this postsynaptic neuron, that's good. That's what's supposed to happen. But what we're going to see once we start talking about these other chemicals is a lot of other chemicals will increase the amount of glutamate going across the synapse, and that becomes a big problem. You get increased activation of these neurons from smoking cigarettes. That's a stimulant. From amphetamines, like for attention deficit meds, that's a stimulant. Psychological stress, that's a stimulant. sleep deprivation manifests like stress. Caffeine manifests like stress. Beta amyloid protein will activate this receptor too, the NMDA receptor. That's not good. I earlier had shown you a voltage-gated calcium channel over here in the axon terminal. EMF will activate that, will open up voltage-gated calcium channels. That can be from holding your cell phone next to your head instead of using speakerphone. That's not good. The next thing that happens is calcium is like the aristocrat. Calcium walks into the room and it starts bossing everybody around. You do this, you do this, you do this, you do this, okay? Versus sodium, potassium, and magnesium, they're like the manual laborers, minimum wage workers, okay? They just have to work nonstop. And this pump right here is the potassium, sodium, ATP pump. And you have to use energy for it. ATP is converted from AT for tri to AD for adenosine diphosphate. So instead of having 3 phosphates, it has 2 phosphates on there. Magnesium, by the way, is needed to make this pump run. This generates a gradient. The gradient is 2 things. It's a chemical gradient because the concentration of sodium is 10 times higher outside the cell than inside the cell. That's because you're pumping out a lot of sodiums at this pump. In addition, the charge is lower inside the cell. It's negative 65 millivolts compared to outside the cell. So sodium really wants to come in the cell. It wants to come in the cell because it's positively charged, so it's attracted to the negative charge inside the cell. That's the voltage gradient. And then it's also a chemical concentration gradient because it's got much higher amounts outside the cell than inside the cell. So this desire of sodium to get into the cell can be coupled to doing other work, to pumping calcium outside the cell. In a sense, these sodium, potassium, ATP pumps, which are about, depends on the neuron, but 50 to 65, 66% of the neuron's energy goes to run this pump. So it's very important. It's like an electrical battery across the plasma membrane of the cell. And the whole point of this is that you need ATP in order to generate an electrical force that enables you to pump calcium out of the cell. There's 2 other ways to pump it out. There's a plasma membrane calcium ATPase. There's a circa, which is really just think of it as being the endoplasmic reticulum. But no matter how you look at it, you need ATP energy, ATP, in order to pump calcium out of the cell. So that what that means is ATP comes from mitochondria. You have to have good mitochondrial function or you cannot, a neuron can't do its job. Okay, here's a neuron. And what I'm showing you here is that there's a lot of things that inhibit neurons. You know, I own about 7 biochemistry books, and I knew that fat, especially SAT fat, saturated fat, inhibits like between complex 3 and coenzyme Q of the inner mitochondrial membrane. But I knew there had to be more. So I went through all my biochem books, and there's nothing about this in all 7 of them. So the average medical student never learns anything about this. But I knew there had to be more. So I started going through all my literature papers, you know, going through PubMed and all this stuff. I quickly found over 50 mitochondrial inhibitors, and they're very common. Tylenol is a mitochondrial inhibitor. Atrazine sprayed on GMO corn is a mitochondrial inhibitor. SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, those are antidepressant drugs. Haldol, antipsychotic drugs like for schizophrenia. Common chemicals like TCE, trichloroethylene for dry cleaning. Chemicals for liquid paper. Lead, F- in your tap water, hydroxynonenal, the chemical from omega-6 oils, the one we talked about a moment ago with Tetsumori Yamashima, the Japanese guy's theory of omega-6 cooking oils causing dementia. So all of these things are damaging your mitochondria. PFOA from nonstick pans, BPA, bisphenol A from hard plastic.
And the crazy thing is, this is just the list you made.
Right.
Probably more.
Yeah. There's more, right. I quickly found over 50 of them. Look at all these antibiotics, fluoroquinolones, beta-lactam penicillins, aminoglycosides antibiotics. Those are like the most common antibiotics. And then it gets worse.
Too much off the topic. We might be getting into this a little bit. I'm just curious, what specifically led you to this idea of neurovascular uncoupling?
Oh, I'm going to show you in one sec. Okay, that was part of it, but here's what it's all about. So I was aware of other things. There is such a thing as excitotoxicity, and other people have written about that, and they were aware of it, that you can overactivate a neuron. For example, if you have a stroke, when brain cells die, they leak out their glutamate into the surrounding extracellular matrix, the extracellular space, and that can activate adjacent neurons and overstimulate them. The neuron has to have enough energy to quickly pump that calcium out of its cytoplasm, or it'll just die. A whole cascade of reactions happens when cytoplasm calcium goes too high and the neurons just die. They go into apoptosis, programmed cell death. So what I'm saying is that neuron has to come up with that energy. It's almost like it has to pay its loan or it gets its butt kicked and it dies, okay? And so the way I drew this diagram here, this is a Peter Rogers theory of dementia, neurovascular uncoupling, is so what did I do that was unique? Well, the other people who had researched it, they simply studied glutamate and they had a very narrow understanding of the topic. One of the things that they had written about, there was a very good book written in 1997 called Excitotoxicity, The Taste That Kills. The author's name was Russell Blaylock. He is a neurosurgeon, and he's a very smart guy, and he was talking about mechanisms of excitotoxicity. So he was aware of intrinsic excitotoxicity from head trauma or from a stroke where brain cells are destroyed and they leak glutamate, okay? And he was very concerned about aspartame. That's the sweetener used in a lot of foods and it was put into soda pop and other places. And so he wrote all about that in particular as being an excitotoxin. Also, a well-known excitotoxin was monosodium glutamate. And there was a guy named John Olney who had discovered that back in 1969, and he had written a lot of papers about that as well. Okay, and then MFG is rather similar, manufactured free glutamate. And food companies do this all the time. They increase the amount of glutamate in foods because we have taste receptors in our mouth and all through our digestive tract that respond positively to activation by binding with glutamate. So the food companies know that. They put that in there because it helps to get people to like a food, to become addicted to it. Okay, so my contribution was because I understand a lot more about nutrition and I know a lot of brain physiology, I was able to figure out this is not just aspartame, this is not just MSG. There's lots of stuff that are contributing here. Also, my understanding of mitochondrial physiology was part of this. All of these things are causing increased glutamate transmission. Stress, sleep deprivation, caffeine, corticosteroid medications, tobacco, amphetamine, attention deficit meds, glycine phosphate, because it's a coincident detector, the NMDA receptor. It has to bind glycine. So the glycine phosphate GP sprayed on soy, GMO soy, contributes to this. Also, turns out the beta amyloid protein, BAP oligomer protein, that also activates the NMDA receptor. Okay. Then I also connected all of this stuff to the Jack Della Torre theory. If you have hypoperfusion, then you don't get enough oxygen and glucose, and your mitochondria can't make the ATP. And then I realized that if you can't run your mitochondria because they're inhibited by all those chemicals, you're screwed because you can't make your ATP to pump the calcium out of the cytoplasm. In addition, if you have inhibitors of SERCA, which means sarcoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, calcium ATPase, really you can think of it as the endoplasmic reticulum. That can be a calcium storage site, reservoir, and that's inhibited pretty much by things that smell bad, like volatile organic chemicals. Somebody has paint, something that transitions. A volatile organic chemical is something that transitions rapidly from a liquid to a solid, like liquid paper, like them painting the wall with a lot of different types of paint. But also things that cause insulin resistance also tend to inhibit SERCA. The higher the hemoglobin A1C, the more you have inhibition of SERCA. So you can't run the ATPase to pump calcium out of the cytoplasm into the endoplasmic reticulum. And then the other thing too is I incorporated the ideas of Martin Pall on oxidative stress related to EMF and also related to peroxynitrite. So all of these things, basically anything that increases the metabolic rate of the neuron increases the risk of uncoupling, because now you need to produce more ATP to compensate for the increased metabolic rate. Anything that drops blood supply will cause this problem. Anything that blocks the function of the mitochondria or the SERCA, your ability to basically get that cytoplasm calcium removed, will increase your risk of uncoupling. Again, I like to call it now, I'm kind of thinking it's easier to understand if I say supply and demand theory. You've got a demand, and the demand is the metabolic rate, MR, the metabolic rate. I jokingly made this GOD as in glucose oxygen delivery. But related to that, of course, is not just glucose oxygen delivery, it should be and energy production. That's why you have to have functional mitochondria. So why do I think my theory is by far the best one? I think it's orders of magnitude better than the other ones. I'll tell you why. Because I tell a person exactly what to do. If you avoid the things that cause hypertension and you avoid the things that cause diabetes, you won't have intracranial atherosclerosis and you won't get stuck on a pill where they overtreat your hypertension and drop your cerebral perfusion. If you avoid dietary sodium, you'll be less likely to get hypertension. Plus, it can also interfere with your ionic gradients on the plasma membrane of the neuron. You avoid the dietary fat, you won't be hypertensive, and then you won't end up getting overtreated for hypertension. You can't change aging. But if you avoid all these causes of atherosclerosis in your heart, you'll be unlikely to get atrial fibrillation. Okay. And also don't drink alcohol because that makes it worse. Okay. You'll be unlikely to get congestive heart failure. You'll be much less likely to get aortic valve regurgitation or aortic valve stenosis. You'll be less likely to encounter circa. You can avoid the mitochondrial inhibitors. Almost all of them are easily avoided. So you avoid them. Okay. Eat the plant foods. So you'll have higher potassium, higher magnesium, and lower sodium in your diet. And then you'll have dilated arteries. Your brain will be well perfused. You'll be less likely to get this. Don't hold your cell phone to your head. If you have a choice, hardwire your house rather than Wi-Fi it. I realize most people have already gone the wrong way on that, but at least use a speakerphone when you're with your cell phone. Don't live next to a cell phone tower. Those are all things that you could do. And so basically, I tell you what to do. Don't drink caffeine like a stupid idiot. Don't smoke tobacco. Don't let your kid get put on amphetamines for attention deficit. Don't take them yourself. Don't eat this GMO soy. And don't eat GMO corn either, because GMO corn's got atrazine. Atrazine inhibits complex 3 of intermitochondrial membrane. So all of those things mess you up. And in the end, what am I sort of saying here? Live like Adam and Eve, but keep your indoor heating and plumbing.
I like the name supply-demand theory. It's a lot more, I think, approachable and makes sense right away to people versus neurovascular uncoupling. So you might want to use that name a little bit more going forward. So when this is happening, I imagine this is happening throughout the whole brain, but are there certain regions of the brain, because of just vascularization, just where the blood vessels go, that are more prone to this uncoupling happening?
Yes, it's more common. It's actually more common in some of the most important areas of the brain. It's more common in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the main memory center, where it's sort of like the information intake center. Like Ellis Island is to the USA. That's what the hippocampus is to the brain.
Peter, do you want to quick stop share? It's on.
Yeah.
Sorry,
okay. So like what Ellis Island is to the USA, or used to be to the USA for immigrant intake, that would be the intake of the brain, the hippocampus. So what the hippocampus does is it takes new information and then it asks itself a question. Are you going to ever use this again? Is this information useful? And if it is useful, what is it related to in our brain? That's how we remember stuff, was we associate it with what we already know. Okay. And what I'm saying is, when you damage that because of you have neurovascular uncoupling here, supply and demand uncoupling, you then will damage those brain cells, and you keep damaging those. Eventually, you're not going to be able to remember things very well.
It's also my understanding the hippocampus is where neurogenesis primarily occurs, which is where you
make
new neurons and connections.
Right. Yeah. So neuro is neuron, genesis is to make new. So neurogenesis is to make a new neuron. Synaptogenesis is to make a new synapse, because each individual neuron has a bunch of synapses. Mm-hmm. And so basically, when you mess that up, you can't form new connections.
Do you want to speak on silent strokes and how common those are?
Yeah, I don't know if I got a picture of it. Let me take a quick look at my slides if I got a picture of it. I maybe do, because seeing the picture helps. Oh yeah, I do. I got some stuff in that.
Yeah, go ahead. I can see it now.
Okay, so I'm going to show you. Here's a normal looking brain. And this is what is called a FLAIR sequence. FLAIR is the best brain MRI sequence. The cerebral spinal fluid is suppressed, so it is dark. But all of the surrounding tissue around the ventricles, these are the cerebral ventricles, is normal. Now, here's a very abnormal brain. This, by the way, would be a normal looking brain for anybody. Okay. This is an abnormal brain. Remember what I said about a tight brain? See how this brain is up against the skull pretty much? This black stuff here is the skull. Whereas the brain over here, this intervening black stuff and then this white stuff here is the fat. This is cerebral spinal fluid. This brain is a shrunken brain, an atrophic brain. These are dilated cerebral sulci filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And these are dilated cerebral ventricles filled with cerebral spinal fluid. When the brain shrinks, the space is filled in with this fluid. But these are a bunch of silent strokes. These white spots, on brain MRI, something that's bright, we call it a hyperintensity. And because it's a FLAIR sequence, I would call, and then it's next to the ventricles, these would be described as multiple periventricular FLAIR hyperintensities, most likely due to chronic atherosclerotic ischemic disease, so lack of blood supply. And so you keep on popping out little pieces of brain, destroying it. Sooner or later, that brain function is going to get worse and worse. And this will be like the typical old person walks with an unsteady gait. They got a slow response time when you ask them a question. and eventually they just lose more and more function and become
So
demented.
is that brain
But
on the right? Is that an extreme example or a typical example?
this, I would say, would be a lousy looking brain for an 80-year-old.
Okay.
So this is bad, but it's not super bad. I see lots of brains worse than this all the time, but this is bad.
That's crazy because it looks like it's not even a human brain. It looks like a completely different brain.
Yeah. Here's a nice looking brain right here. This is completely normal. This is 100% normal.
Like if
And
you
I can
showed me
also tell
the
you,
brain on the right, I'd be like, oh, that person's dead.
yeah, but a lot of them, they can have a lot of these white spots, all these small strokes, and still be walking and talking.
Just
You know, I wouldn't trust them to balance my checkbook. You know, I wouldn't want them to be my partner in jeopardy, but they're still able to get around a lot of people with a surprising amount of small strokes. You know.
Okay. Do you want to exit out of the
Oh,
presentation?
I want to show you one other thing too.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
hypertension. Can you see this slide now?
Yeah, I can see it.
This is a brain MRI, something called an SWI sequence, susceptibility weighted image. And the gist of this sequence is that it's more sensitive to small bleeds in the brain. So hypertension causes this characteristic pattern of a lot of small, all these black spots, these are called hypointensities centrally. Those are small strokes from bleeding into the brain. And hypertension will cause that, especially centrally in the basal ganglia. In the periphery here, these are characteristically thought of as being a different disease, something called cerebral amyloid angiopathy, which can be associated with so-called Alzheimer's. But I think the whole thing's a bit of a joke. What I'm getting at is I look at brains all the time, and the diseases don't read the books, because very often in hypertension, I see these peripheral microbleeds. We call them CMBs, cerebral microbleeds. They're in the periphery of the brain. So these would be peripheral CMBs, cerebral microbleeds. These would be central CMBs. So the central ones, you just call that hypertension. You don't even think about it. But the peripheral ones, you have to ask yourself the question, are these from hypertension or are they from cerebral amyloid angiopathy? Either way, in my opinion, the main thing that causes them, central or peripheral, is the same thing. It's hypertension.
Right.
Okay, you can also get a few isolated ones from trauma, but you wouldn't get this diffusive pattern with trauma.
I see. Who decides, like, does the doctor usually consult you? Like, who decides what type of scan to run?
Well, the doctors usually order whatever they think is best. Usually in the acute setting, like the patient comes in the emergency room, the first thing that's done is to get a CAT scan. This is a CAT scan, okay? You can tell it's a CAT scan because the bone of the skull is very dense. CAT scan is based on radiation, and that is all, you know, our radiation beam is passed through one side of the skull, and the detector receives it on the other side of the skull. So CAT scan, you can do it on anybody, even if they're demented, uncooperative, you can scan them. Okay, whereas an MRI, the patient has to be cooperative, because a CAT scan, you can do it in like 1 minute, scan their brain, versus an MRI is going to take about 45 minutes to get pictures of their brain. So you have to have a cooperative patient to do a brain MRI. Some people have metal near their eyeball or some other contraindication to brain MRI, versus anybody can get a CAT scan. So CAT scan is king of the road for the immediate emergency room evaluation of a patient. This is a big bleed. So this is a hypertensive hemorrhage. We call this an IPH, intraparenchymal hemorrhage. It's in the basal ganglia. It's rather large. You know, I would look at it from eyeballing it here. I'd probably put this at about 5 centimeters. This at about 2 centimeters. So 2 by 5 centimeter right basal ganglia, intraparenchymal hemorrhage. You know, more specifically, it's in the lentiform nucleus. Okay, there is moderate mass effect upon the right frontal horn. I would drop a plumb line from the anterior falx to the posterior falx, and there's probably about 2 millimeters of subfalcine shift between the falx. Okay, and so this patient, usually it has to be more than 5 millimeters before they'll take him to the operating room. And with a basal ganglia hemorrhage, it has to be even worse than that, the midline shift, because very difficult for neurosurgery to drain that. If they drain that, the patient would be totally paralyzed on the opposite side of the body. So what there's a couple other things they could do to try to stabilize this patient. They're obviously going to watch their blood pressure. But anyways, this is very rare. I hardly ever see these intraparenchymal hemorrhages, whereas I see a bunch of these every day. So hypertension, you know, it's a very bad disease. And how do you prevent it? The most important thing is don't eat high-fat food. High-fat food. The main cause of hypertension is high-fat food. Also, you know, sodium, but the fat's more important than the sodium.
And if anyone's hearing this, I guess, for the first time, check out Peter's channel. Check out my first interview with him where we talk about blood flow. I just want to ask about, so you talked about the Torre theory. You talked about the Japanese side with the H&E and the oils. What is the sort of conventional, I guess, view on dementia? Like if you went to
the conventional one is Alzheimer's. And that's why I think it's a joke, because if you look at the textbooks of internal medicine and the internal medicine subspecialties, I would tell you this. Any chapter you open for the common chronic diseases, they always say the same thing. They say, number one, it's related to aging. Number two, it seems to be part genetic. Number three, it might sometimes be due to infection. Number four, it's partly due to socioeconomic disparities and racism. Okay. Number five, it's idiopathic. And that's all a bunch of horseshit. Okay. And why do they do that? The question is, why do they do that? And I'm telling you, all the medical books are wrong. They're completely wrong. And I know you're going to think, oh, that's a big statement. How can I say it? No, I'm 100% confident in that. And I'll explain why in just a moment. The reason they do that is they have just taken away all the power from the patient. If you tell a person all of these things making you sick are things that you have no control over, the patients can't do anything. It makes the patient into a dumb animal. They basically say, look, nobody knows what causes your disease. There's nothing you can do about it. Take our pill, and if the pill doesn't work, we'll operate on you. Okay, that's what patients are told all day long, every day for the common diseases. But we just talked about hypertension being a risk factor for intracranial stroke, atherosclerosis, and dementia. In the USA, the majority of people over 50 are hypertensive. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I thought would be the main sort of reasoning out there. Be like, oh yeah, it's just vascular dementia. You're just not getting good blood flow. You're getting silent strokes.
I know, but here's how it gets good.
Yeah.
In America, the majority of the blacks have hypertension off the charts. But then you start reading the medical literature, the nutrition literature. 1929, author's name is Donison, journal is The Lancet, the paper about blood pressure in the African native, which is in Kenya for this paper. And guess what? 1,800 consecutive hospital admissions. What percentage of the patients were hypertensive?
Zero. You asked me this on the
Zero. Okay. So give me a break. All right. And then if you look at hypertension, what causes hypertension? It's mostly high-fat diets. And that's why I always say eat a low-fat diet to help prevent hypertension. Sodium plays into it, but it's not just sodium. It's the relative ratio of sodium to potassium. So all the good stuff comes from plant foods. You get the potassium, you get the magnesium, it's low in sodium, you get the nitric oxide precursors, the nitrates, you get the antioxidants, you get the fiber to prevent leaky gut, postprandial endotoxemia, postprandial amyloidogenic clotting, because atherosclerosis is a blood clot. So you prevent all the problems. So what I'm saying is, what the book ought to say, instead of all this bull crap, it should say, patients who eat low-fat, plant-based diets without oils and excessive sodium added, they do not get hypertension. That would be the answer. Done. Yeah. But they'll never do that because it's a multi-million-dollar business selling antihypertensive medication. One
of the factors you said for the decoupling was lack of sleep. How important is that sleep for cognitive health? Is there such a thing as too much sleep? How does oversleeping affect cognitive function? That's a bit of a question coming from me because sometimes I sleep like 10 hours. So
yeah, it's good to get your sleep. Probably most people need about 7 to 8 hours. Some might need a little more. It depends if they're growing. It depends if they're a little bit sleep deprived from the previous night. But your brain cleans itself during sleep. During the daytime, your brain is active. It has to be active to keep you alive. And because of that, it needs precise ionic gradients around the extracellular matrix of all its neurons. So it cannot mess around. What I'm getting at is, at night while you're asleep, your brain goes offline and your neurons become like an English Victorian where they dump out their chamber pots, pour their waste into the street, which is the extracellular matrix. And then they open up the cerebrospinal fluid space around the neurons. It's called the perivascular space of Virchow-Robin. And the cerebrospinal fluid rinses the waste products away. And they're taken back up into the vascular system, and then they travel through a lymphatic system. There's a name for that. It's called the glymphatic system. The GL at the beginning of glymphatic comes from glial cells. Those are the supporting cells of the brain that you can also call them the mama cells. They support the neuron. Okay, and they open up the perivascular space. And then there's lymphatics in the meninges, the outer wrappings of the brain, not the brain parenchyma itself. And they will then take the waste products and return them to the vascular system. So you can only run that while you're asleep at night. You can't run it in the daytime because you need to maintain your ionic gradients. So you need to get your sleep or your brain can't clean itself and you accumulate waste products in your neurons.
Talking about that return to the vascular system, there's a lot to get in here, but you've covered some of the compounds, the estrogenics, certain halogens, excess glutamate, our own cell phones, heavy metals that cause damage. I want to ask about the blood-brain barrier. In some ways, I think you mentioned it's analogous to our Cohen's defenses, Tell me the role this barrier plays and whether it's able to even protect us from so many potential harmful compounds.
Yeah, like we were talking about, the brain cells have to maintain a very precise gradient. So imagine this green marker here, highlighter, is your neuron. You have to have a precise grade. You have to have precise levels of calcium and potassium and sodium all around it. Otherwise, it won't work. Your gradients will be messed up. It won't be able to receive and send action potential. So what happens is there's a very carefully monitored blood-brain barrier on the outside of these cells. And the reason for that is the blood changes a lot. If you eat a big dinner, lots of food chemicals from your dinner are going to go into your blood, and you don't want those pouring into the brain parenchyma. They will screw up all your brain cells. So the blood-brain barrier keeps all that stuff out. It only lets in what it needs. Yeah, it's going to need some glucose. It's going to need a little bit of some other things. But its job is to only let in what it needs and keep all the rest of the stuff out. So while the blood changes a lot after a meal, the perivascular space, the microenvironment of the neurons changes very little. And so that's the purpose of the blood-brain barrier, to protect the brain cells from chemical changes that would decrease neuronal function. Okay, then the question becomes, well, what damages the blood-brain barrier? And so if the patient has a stroke, that will break apart the blood-brain barrier in the area of the stroke. If the patient has head trauma and some brain tissue is injured, that will break apart the blood-brain barrier. And then somehow a neurological message is sent down to the gut, and you tend to get a little bit of leaky gut once you have leaky blood-brain barrier from a stroke or brain trauma. And the relevance of that is, I tell the neurologist, you should be making sure your post-stroke, post-head trauma patients are getting adequate dietary fiber to protect them from leaky gut. Because if you simultaneously have leaky gut and leaky blood-brain barrier, a toxin in your gut could get across your gut barrier, pass up into your blood, and then cross the leaky blood-brain barrier. Does that make sense?
That makes
a
sense.
double whammy.
Yeah.
Okay, and it kind of goes the other way too. A lot of the things that cause leaky gut, they will also cause leaky blood-brain barrier. For example, when you eat fiber, which comes from plant foods, that fiber goes into your intestinal tract. The good bacteria convert it to short-chain fatty acids. The short-chain fatty acids, in particular butyrate, are used by the gut lining cells to make tight junctions that protect you from leaky gut. But some of that butyrate also goes into your blood up to your brain, and your brain cells, or your blood-brain barrier, they use that same butyrate to make tight junctions as well. And because they make tight junctions as well, what I'm saying is the same thing that protects your gut protects your blood-brain barrier.
Yeah.
And so it makes you smarter. Actually, eating fiber makes you smarter.
Last time we talked about dementia, you mentioned insulin degrading enzyme also degrades beta amyloid. And when insulin is trapped in the blood, has a higher affinity for the insulin, leading to more beta amyloid accumulation. And you briefly, I guess we already made this brief connection regarding oils damaging the pancreas cells that produce insulin through that H&E mechanism. Are there other significant pathways impacted by diabetes that lead to cognitive decline?
Yeah, diabetes makes people stupid. People have even called, so-called Alzheimer's dementia as type 3 diabetes. And that happens for a couple of reasons. Number one, we just showed that picture of thickening the wall of the capillaries, so less oxygen reaches the brain cell, so that's a problem. And the next thing is that it is going to cause that all throughout the brain, dropping the baseline delivery of oxygen and glucose, making those neurons more vulnerable to apoptosis. There's also something called MAMs. Let me get the picture of it. I know I got it in here somewhere.
Yeah, sure. Sounds good.
Because it's kind of an interesting comment. So smart thing for a diabetic is really quickly get your act together, eat a low-fat vegan diet. I'm going to show you something else, a couple of things that are kind of cool here about diabetes.
I also want to ask about hypoglycemia, because I know, especially people with type 1 diabetes, they'll have episodes of hypoglycemia, and how harmful is that to the brain, and what kind of, I guess, damage you see, and whether that's even reversible or not.
Yeah, let me get to that next here. I'll just show this slide here too. So here's the blood-brain barrier.
Perfect. Okay, go ahead.
BBB is blood-brain barrier. These are glucose type 1 transporters. Glucose type 1 transporters don't depend on insulin. They just let glucose come into the brain. So now it's in the perivascular space, extracellular matrix, meaning outside the neuron. Here's a neuron. Here's an astrocyte, a little bit shaped like a star. And that's the helping cell, the supporting cell, the mama cells of the brain. They help take care of the neurons. The neurons are the communication cells that send the messages. All right, so if you read a textbook, it'll tell you that the neurons have glucose type 3 transporters. That's the number 3 here, GLUT3, and that these are not dependent on insulin. But that's incorrect. when you actually read the scientific papers, neurons also have glucose type 4 transporters. The glucose type 4 transporter is important because it's dependent on insulin in order for it to become activated and to open up. So if you've got insulin resistance, you not only get insulin resistance in the periphery of the body, outside the brain, you also get insulin resistance in the brain, and you will not be able to activate these glucose type 4 transporters, meaning you can't get enough glucose into these neurons if they become active. Because a neuron has a variable amount of activity. If you're sitting there, on a chair, counting the daisies, saying to yourself, she loves me not, she loves me not, that's not going to use up that much energy. But then you start walking down a path in the forest, and all of a sudden there's 3 coyotes running towards you like they want to eat you up. Now you're like, uh-oh, I got to climb a tree real fast. Should I fight? What should I do? Okay.
You find yourself interviewing Dr. Peter Rogers.
Yeah. So you see, you got to get active really fast. So the metabolic rate of that neuron is going to go through the roof real fast, from 0 to 60 miles per hour. So in that case, now you're going to really need those glucose 4. Before, at rest, you didn't need them. But now, once there's an immediate intense stress, you need these going up to the plasma membrane, bringing in as much glucose as possible to the active neurons. And if you can't do that because of insulin resistance, this neuron can't get enough energy, and it's at high risk to die from apoptosis. So people with bad intracranial atherosclerosis, bad diabetes, they really can't handle rapid cognitive thinking. Okay, and now I'm going to show you another little trick about the diabetic brain cells that really messes them up. The endoplasmic reticulum is a reservoir, a storage site for calcium, and it has a lot of calcium. It has connections to the mitochondria. So here's a mitochondria, outer mitochondrial membrane. Here's the inner mitochondrial membrane. Here's the mitochondrial matrix. Krebs cycle, also called the tricarboxylic acid cycle, runs in the mitochondrial matrix. Electron transport runs on the inner mitochondrial membrane. Okay, OMM is outer mitochondrial membrane. IMM is inner mitochondrial membrane. I'm going through all this stuff because it'll help you to make sense about what's to happen. So the endoplasmic reticulum has little membranes that are in contact with the mitochondria, and these are called MAMs, M-A-M, mitochondrial associated membranes. And the purpose of these things is to enable your brain cells to go from 0 to 60 miles an hour very quickly. And what they do is, once they sense danger, an acute serious stress moment, they will release calcium from the endoplasmic reticulum storage sites to go straight into the mitochondria. And the reason it'll do this is because this causes a rapid upregulation, meaning an increase in the amount of Krebs cycle enzymes. And so what it's doing is it's enabling the mitochondria to run faster energy production. But here's where you run into a problem. If the person simultaneously has an acute stressful event, this calcium is going to start pouring into the mitochondria. Now, by nature, our ancestors never had these super high fat diets, okay, on a routine basis, day after day, week after week. So they wouldn't have this diabetes. But once you've got this high fat meals on a daily basis and you've got high insulin resistance, you're still going to have stressful events in your life, and you're still going to push calcium from your endoplasmic reticulum into your mitochondria. But the problem is, because of the insulin resistance, you can't get these glucose type 4 transporters to go up to the plasma membrane, meaning that you can't get the glucose into the cell. You'll have insulin resistance, and that turns out to be a big problem because the calcium keeps pouring into the mitochondrial matrix, but now there's no compensatory glucose to show up and keep these enzymes busy. So because of that, it doesn't get negative feedback to turn itself off, and you get an excessive amount of calcium going into the mitochondrial matrix, and that will cause the mitochondria to die, to precipitate and die. And so cells die from that. They go into apoptosis. So,
and that's basically supply and demand all over again.
Yeah, so they're screwed. And that's why diabetes is such a bad disease. I can tell you this, if you ask a doctor, any like internal medicine doctor, who are your stupidest patients? They'll tell you, number one, they're kidney failure patients. Kidney failure patients all kind of become really cognitively slow. Number two, that's because their blood's hyperthrombotic. Okay, that's one of the contributing main reasons. Number two, they'll tell you their sleep apnea patients are real stupid because you sit there talking to them and they're falling asleep and then they can't maintain a conversation. The bad sleep apnea patients. A lot of people have milder sleep apnea. But number three, they'll tell you all of my chronic diabetics are stupid. And that's the reason right there I just showed you, because they got all this intracranial atherosclerosis. Their glucose type 4 transporters aren't working. They can't handle subtle, nuanced, complex thought. And I can tell you most of the time when I talk to nutrition patients, they're like, oh, they're kind of spaced out, or they think it's a joke because all their life they've been told you just got to take pills.
Yeah.
And then they'll say things like this. They'll say, oh, no, doc. No, doc. It ain't nutrition. It ain't nutrition. I eat pretty well. I go, oh, really? And they go, it's genetic. I go, well, why do you say it's genetic? They go, well, I know it's genetic. You know, this is a guy who's like 52 years old. By the way, I'm 60 and I have zero medical problems. Okay. So the guy's about 52 years of age. It would be like typical. And he's like, well, I know it's genetic because my sister had to have open heart surgery and my brother had to have heart surgery. My dad had to have open heart surgery. You know, my mom died of cancer when she was young. He goes, it has to be genetic. And I said, did it ever occur to you that it's maybe because you all eat the same thing? You know, there's the truth right there.
That's a Chicago accent right there.
Yeah. And so I say to the guy, like, what did you have for dinner last night? He goes, well, you know, I try to have some fish. You know, fish is good for you. And I try to have a little bit of chicken. You know, I have a little bit of olive oil on it. And, you know, I might have a beer, you know, and I eat pretty well. I'm like, no, that's all high fat food and animal food. It plugs up your arteries, you know, and I feel sorry for them, but they don't get it. They're not even in the ballpark.
I see.
And quite often they're cognitively slow. So it's just sad because I know what's coming from. They're going to go get chopped up. What's going to happen is they're going to have atherosclerosis in their foot, gangrene in their foot. They're going to go for open heart surgery, endless problems. They're going to be in kidney failure, getting dialysis catheters stuck into their neck. Then they're going to get a dialysis graft thing put into their arm. And so all this suffering, you know, and all they got to do is eat a low-fat vegan diet. That's why I love the low-fat vegan diet. I mean, you can help so many people if they were with it enough to be helped.
Yeah, which is why it's important that you're here getting the word out. Shifting topics a little bit, talking about different approaches to physical exercise, mental activities for maintaining cognitive health.
Yeah, I think most people mean well and they want to do well, but what most of them end up is coming up with excuses. They will tell you that, you know, I'm just too busy. I would like to read, but I have no time. I would like to exercise, but I have no time. And I will tell you this, I've worked in many different hospitals, okay, all through my long career. I've been a doctor over 30 years, and I always take the stairs. I always take the stairs to get exercise. What percentage of hospital employees take the stairs?
Oh, I have no idea, but less than 5%?
It's less than 1%.
Wow.
Okay. So what I'm saying is all these people who got no time to exercise, they're too lazy and stupid to just walk up the stairs. If you just walk up the stairs every day, let's say you work on the 5th floor or something, you will get at least 5 floors of exercise every day. And then you have to go downstairs for some other reason, whatever it is, clinical reason. Well, then take the stairs when you come back up. Do that every day, and you will get significant amount of exercise. When you park your car in the parking lot at the hospital, park as far as you can. Okay. If you have a parking lot garage that's, let's say, 10 stories high, you know, park. All I'm saying is set up your life so that you have to walk a lot and go up a lot of stairs. For example, I had a discussion with the wife at the house about who gets the bedroom, who gets the bathroom next to the parents' bedroom, right? And of course, the wife has a lot more power in a marriage than the husband does because he always wants sex more than she does. Plus, if there's a divorce, she knows she comes out of it better than he does. So whenever they want something, they often throw their weight around. And she's like, you know what? I really need the bathroom down here with the closet and stuff. I really need it. You don't need it. You don't have much of a wardrobe. And I'm like, you know what, sweetheart? What you do when you're a husband in a discussion with a wife, even if you know you're going to lose, you got to act like you're really sad that you got ripped off, okay? And then you gain some points for future reference. So I'm like, well, it doesn't seem very fair, but okay, fine. I'll take the bathroom, you know, let's say on the upstairs floor, or I'll take the closet in the basement floor. And the reason you do that is because all day long, I'm running up and down stairs. Who do you think's in better physical condition, me or the wife?
Not you.
No comparison. No comparison. Thank you. I rest my case. So that's what I'm saying is you make an opportunity to work out. I'll lift weights once a week, but every day I always force myself to walk extra. Also, like when I'm walking home at the end of the day, when I'm walking out of my job, I could walk really slow to my car. When I'm in the parking lot, I walk really fast. Why do I do it? Because I'm training my body. Yes, I expect you to walk fast because it's a use it or lose it system. If you force your body to do things that are challenging for it, it'll maintain those skills, those capacities. You know, I used to wrestle in college, but I stopped wrestling because I was working too much. And now I can't really wrestle like the way I did when I was in college. What I'm saying is your body, you lose it or lose it. Use it or lose it. So lifting weights, you maintain your strength. And I'm always pushing myself. Like when I'm at home, again, I go up and down the stairs all day. So when I go up and down the stairs, I go fast. So I can still do all those things pretty fast. I've had lots of times where I have to walk a couple of miles and I'll walk around with some older guys about my age. And it's a walk in the park for me. It's easy for me. It's nothing. If you do high intensity training, like on stairs, any type of walking on the ground becomes easy, even for miles.
High intensity versus moderate. I guess, would you say better for most people to aim for high intensity just because
If you can, yeah. So yeah, like for example, if I'm going to walk, let's say I have to walk 15 flights of stairs. Well, if I walk 15 flights of stairs slow, that's still good exercise.
Yeah.
But if I walk fast, then it's great exercise. Why not walk fast, you know? Because I don't care if I get sweaty. I'll just wipe the sweat off, you know?
You mentioned
So what?
reading. Do you want to talk more about cognitive, I guess, activities and how important that we can?
Yeah, and then the other thing too is I think I got a picture of it in here. Let me show the picture of my magical bathroom, because that makes a point. Because you know, a lot of people will say to me, "Oh, I don't have any time to read. I just don't have time. You don't understand how busy I am." And I'm like, "Oh, bullshit. You're busier than me. I don't believe it." Oh crap. Let me get the right picture again. I was close to it.
You know, I think it is, and this is something I wanted to talk to you about after this interview, actually. Rather than saying not enough time, I think it's they don't have enough energy for it.
Oh yeah, you know what? That's part of the story too.
Not sleeping well, poor blood flow, all these things add up, right?
Actually, you're right. People are tired. So the question is, how can I get more energy?
Yeah.
You're right. That is true.
Yeah.
But I'll talk about that a little bit too. Part of where energy comes in part from having a sense of purpose. So that's why you want to tell yourself a story about your own life and about what your goals are that works for you. So here's my bathroom. And you can see I'm sitting on the loo right here. I got this little portable table here. And I got this idea because I was reading a biography of Mozart. And Mozart used to write letters while he was sitting on the loo. And he would write things like, "I think it only fitting to write while shitting." And I said to myself, well, gee, I could read while I'm sitting there. So I put this portable table in the bathroom, and I always have a textbook on here. Usually a textbook, sometimes a small book like a paperback. And then I have this little table in the bathroom, and I always have a paperback on there. So for number ones, I'm always reading a paperback. I got the idea from that when I saw the Monty Python skit, "Every sperm is sacred." And so I said to myself, every void is sacred. So I don't go into my bathroom without reading at least one page of a book. And quite often, quite a lot more than that. I put pictures of some of my heroes on the wall. I got a picture of Victor Hugo, the great writer. I got a picture of Caldwell Esselstyn over there. I got a picture of the great comedian Rodney Dangerfield over there, and a whole bunch of other ones. So they inspire me. Seeing people who are your mentors or role models that inspire you, that gives you more energy. All these pictures of the brain were taped to the wall when I was studying for my neuroradiology renewal boards. Okay. So I would put them in there, and I would like look at them. I'd look away, and I'd memorize them. So I would know every single part of those things. But what I'm trying to say is every week in the bathroom, I read an average of one book cover to cover. Okay. Then when I'm in the car, I read an average of one book a week too, because I got to commute about an hour each way. And so that's 10 hours of driving every week. And the average book's about 10 hours long on audiobooks. So every week, just from the bathroom to sitting in the car listening to audio CDs, I listen I go through 2 books a week. And then while I'm eating dinner, I usually have my bowl of starch on a table, and then I'll be looking at a book on the computer. I'll either be reading a book on the computer or reading scientific papers or watching educational videos. And I go through the equivalent of a book every week in that way. So every week, without changing my use of time at all, I read 3 books a week, minimum. So that means every year I'm guaranteed to read at least 150 books. And that adds up year after year. Most people read 0 books. Average American reads 0 books per year. So that's why, like, people who know me, that's the thing that strikes them as the most extraordinary. I have a lot of knowledge in my head. And it's just because I'm always reading, you know. Don't get me wrong. If there were people home in the kitchen who wanted to talk to me, I would talk to them, you know. Like my kid comes home from school, he's got a question about school. Fine, I'll talk to him. But usually a kid don't want to talk to me. A kid wants to, you know, talk to their girlfriend or their friends or something. So I'm around if anybody wants to talk to me, but most of the time I'm by myself. So I just make sure I get some learning done at the same time. I used to like, back in the good old days, my old house, my new house kind of sucks, but at the old house, there was a big circular area to walk around, and I would play an audiobook, and I would walk around eating my food, listening to the audiobook. I really liked that. But in my new house, everybody's all crowded together. So if I were to do that, they would start yelling at me for making too much noise. But
When I used
That's
to
how I did.
study in university, a friend of mine, the same friend that's doing his residency in radiology, he would walk around the labs just looking at the book, and it works quite well. Keeps yourself awake as well, right? A lot of people fall asleep at the desk. I was just
Yep.
thinking that while looking at your bathroom, I'm like, you know what would be great for most people is if we could start to leverage all this technology we have, whether you have some sort of weight system that monitors you, but just the way that the Wi-Fi can't get in that room, and that's going to prevent people going from their phone, or even if they go on their phone, they're forced to at least read a book or something like that. So
Yeah, there's things you could do. Like I'll even put like a mirror to block Wi-Fi around my study
okay, I
area.
didn't know that works, but yeah,
Yeah, I don't know how well
yeah,
it works,
I
but
would,
it's
I
better
would,
than
I
nothing.
mean,
You can't completely control it,
yeah,
but you might as well
technology is
control
speeding up though. I'm sure, if you have the money, time, energy, you could camera your whole place, keep it a local server so your data's not getting out everywhere, but have it so you basically have an algorithm that once it sees you enter the washroom, it just cuts the Wi-Fi from the house.
it. Right, right. You want to have an
I'm sure you
on-off
can,
switch
yeah, I'm sure you
or the
can make
hardwire
it so.
stuff.
Yeah,
There's
I'm sure you
things you
can
could
make it so
do.
you can add enough hoops to it, but obviously that takes time and energy itself. But I think for someone
I
myself, it's like, I love to read when I'm in there and whatnot, but one, I'm a bit of a germaphobe. And then two, you would need a way to cut that phone off as much as possible. Or else.
Yeah, I also have like a bed wrap. So there's such a thing as called an EMF wrap for a bed. I have one of
Have
those.
you tested it? How well do those
Yeah, I
things
did.
work?
I
Okay.
buy an EMF tester and
Yeah.
I have and then I check it all over the house and I check it in the bedroom. In my bedroom area, it's 0.
I see. That would be good for people, especially if you mentioned cell, like living near cell towers and whatnot. Like that research is just coming out, but we've already known about like if you're near their power lines, your children are more likely to get leukemia, right? So,
Yeah,
that's
why take an unnecessary
yeah,
risk if you don't have to? And you can't completely escape all this stuff, but you minimize it as best you
exactly.
can.
Okay, so let me go to my next question. Okay, this is a bit of a thought experiment. We talked about diet, sleep, exercise, caffeine, reading. Are there any potential treatments? I guess imagine if you're working for the drug company side of things. Are there potential treatments or interventions that rise from this idea of neurovascular uncoupling, apart from everything we talked about?
Well, I guess selling all that protection from EMF stuff would be one thing. Um, it's hard to make medicines work like foods because foods
Mhm.
are already designed to do what they do. The
Right.
main thing I focus on is avoiding all the bad stuff so you get good blood flow and you avoid the stimulants, you avoid the mitochondrial
I saw
inhibitors.
an article recently. I was talking about how food companies have finally figured out a way to make food have healthy using this like compound, right? You know what that compound was? No, no, the
What?
compound's legit. Resistant starch. They want to start adding resistant starch to food.
That's funny.
So I
Yeah,
got full
exactly.
circle.
Why eat real starch when you can eat processed food starch? And
Yeah,
then to
or
prevent it
you
from
process food
spoiling,
with a tiny little bit of now with resistant starch.
yeah.
Yeah, we're coming full circle though. Okay, you talked about this briefly. There's probably people in my situation. I've never played much soccer, football, rugby growing up. I've had a few like head injuries in my 20s, few concussions. There was a drunk driver that rear-ended us years ago. I fell while hiking, hit my head on a rock. And then recently I had whiplash as well. So even with my healthy diet and lifestyle, you see a lot of patients. So I'm curious, am I at risk for dementia, cognitive decline 40, 50 years from now? And what are some of your ideas for, I guess, a risk profile for someone who's had 5 to 10 cases of head trauma?
Okay, well, you can't change the past. You
Yeah.
really, you got to play it where it lies, where you're at. So basically, what I say is just do all the good stuff and avoid all the bad stuff. And so what that means is, imagine yourself like a Super Mario Brothers. I think I got a picture of that. Let me just show
Mhm.
my Super Mario Brothers picture because I think this is what life is really like. Um, I know. Here they are. So your Super Mario Brothers here, and you want to do the things that are good for you. So you're going to go through your obstacle course, the green energy things, you do them and you get energy. You do the bad things, you lose energy. So what he should do is avoid any sport with head trauma like playing soccer or, MMA or boxing or anything. That's all stupid. It causes brain damage. Seek out the good food, low fat, vegan, whole foods, starch based, organic only, no oils. Avoid all those toxic drugs, including tobacco, marijuana, stimulants, etc. Get your sleep, protect yourself from EMF to the extent you can, and avoid unnecessary stress. Basically, don't argue with obnoxious, stupid people. Just avoid them. Avoid caffeine. That's also a stimulant. Avoid alcohol. It's a brain toxin. Avoid foods that are sprayed with toxic chemicals. That's why I eat organic. Even though it's not perfect, it's better than non-organic. And so then the relevance is, well, why should you study? Well, the reason why you should study nutrition, health, and toxicology is so you learn what to seek out and you learn what to avoid.
You learn the rules of, playing Super Mario.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of another quote. Yeah. Life is the only game where the object of the game is to learn the rules of the game.
I like that one. Yeah. A listener requested this question. It's similar to a question I had lined up, but I like the way they worded it, so I'll ask it. They love to know why elderly individuals can completely lose their cognition or memory when they get an infection or experience, I guess, physical trauma, like a broken bone. Sometimes cognition comes back partially, totally, or not at all after the event. What's happening during these events? And I'm curious, is this related to that glutamate release that happens? I guess you would call that penumbra areas. Are those two things?
There's some different things that could happen. Number one, they could have had trauma to the brain at the time. Number two, they could have been hypotensive and had cerebral hypoxia, anoxic encephalopathy, hypoxia injury to the brain. Number three, big fracture. There could have been a fat embolus and fat from the broken bone, the bone marrow embolized to the brain. Number four, they could have been sedated with memory damaging drugs. And when they had to go for surgery for the fracture, let's say they had a fractured hip and they have to go for a hip replacement, that could have happened. They could have had a post-operative deep vein thrombosis in the leg and suffered a subsequent pulmonary embolism, and that led to cerebral hypoxia, hypotensive, obstructive hypoxic shock. They could get an infection of the brain, a meningitis. That's rare, though. It's a lot less common than people think it is. That could cause brain damage. They could have postprandial endotoxemia with amyloidogenic clotting contributing to occluding small vessels in the brain. They could have some severe trauma. Some severe psychological trauma that makes things worse. They could have a reaction to the anesthetics for general anesthesia, and that causes.
Do you want to talk about that general anesthesia? And I guess you mentioned the medications that make you, go asleep. There's people that get their wisdom teeth removed, for example. Are there certain things or ways you can request that are less harmful?
Yeah, like the typical stupid person always says before a procedure, "Doc, I want to be knocked out. I don't want to remember nothing from this procedure." And in my opinion, that's the exact opposite wrong thing to say. Like I went for a colonoscopy and I told them I don't want any sedation. Okay. And so of course my family teased me. "Oh, you don't want sedation because you enjoyed it." And I'm like, "No, you jerk. I don't want sedation with those benzodiazepines because they can damage the hippocampal memory center." Okay. And I will never even go for another colonoscopy because if you eat a low-fat vegan diet, your risk is so low, the colonoscopy is higher risk of danger than, And also, the reason I did it originally is because my mother had died of colon cancer. But once I understood I could protect, and the gastroenterologist told me, he goes, "Your colon is so normal, it's not even funny." And so that made me then, once I understood it, not ever want to go back for that. But the point of the matter is, I don't want any drugs, because I'm always afraid something's going to hurt my memory or have some other type of side effect. Now, sometimes you have no choice. Sometimes the patient might really need a surgery. So if I had to go for a surgery, I would tell the anesthesiologist, please use whatever drugs are least likely to cause a memory side effect, a brain damage side effect. Okay. And because they'll do weird things. My father went for open heart surgery post-op. He had a coronary artery bypass graft, a cabbage. In the SICU, surgical intensive care unit, they ran him really hypotensive, something like 95/60, or maybe even lower, 90/60. It was many years ago now. Mm-hmm. And I called the anesthesiologist. I go, "Why are you running his pressure so low?" And he goes, "Well, they had plugged in the arteries. That's called an anastomosis, where they sew in the new arteries. And they go, 'We don't want him to bleed. It is anastomosis.' I'm like, "Well, I don't want him to stroke in his brain when you're running him so hypotensive." Luckily, he came out of it well. But I say to myself, my dad was probably one of the healthiest patients that ever had a cabbage, because he was a doctor who went jogging all the time. He's a relatively healthy guy. He ate a reasonable diet. Whereas a lot of the patients that go for cabbage, they're not healthy. They're train wrecks. And so they're much more likely to get post-operative, from cardiopulmonary bypass machine. They're more likely to get what's called pump head, cognitive impairment. It happens in like up to 15-20% of patients from being hypotensive. And it's not just being on the pump in the operating room. It's the post-op phase where the anesthesiologist is running them hypotensive. can contribute to that in a big way.
Good to know. Yeah. Especially people, I know people can have loved ones that undergo these procedures. So at least that piece of information can save their brain a little bit. You have a whole chapter in your dementia book, Poor Man's Guide to Prevent Dementia, Raise IQ, on iron overload. Do you want to briefly share, maybe just in a couple of minutes, what's going on with iron and dementia?
Yeah, iron has two main valences. It's a transitional metal, meaning that it can have a variable valence, a variable charge, and it most commonly is Fe2 plus or Fe3 plus. And what happens in the blood is if you have free iron in the blood, it can cycle back and forth between Fe2 plus Fe3 plus, Fe2 plus Fe3 plus, and hand off electrons to oxygen molecules in its vicinity and cause some very damaging reactions. The way to think of iron is the way you think of fire. If you had a fire in your house, it's good to have a fire in the stove. You can cook your food. It's good to have a fire in the fireplace. You could warm your hands on the fireplace, stay warm. It's good to have a fire, a flame, a pilot light in your water heater to heat up your water, okay? But you don't want that fire anywhere else. Anywhere else in your house, it'll destroy things. That's what iron is like in the human body. So we've got a lot of iron binding proteins. Inside of our cells, we got ferritin. Each one binds like 4,500 iron molecules, and it keeps them sequestered away. In our blood, we got this thing, it's like a little kayak with two binding sites for iron that transports it around the body wherever it needs to go. We do need a lot of iron that we get naturally to function as part of our hemoglobin for carrying oxygen around. We've got iron in some of the proteins in our inner mitochondrial membrane for electron transport as part of ATP production. So those are the good purposes of iron. But what happens is people who eat meat, especially red meat, become iron overloaded. People who eat iron fortified foods become iron overloaded. So the average man in a Western country becomes iron overloaded in his 20s, and it just gets worse with time. The average woman doesn't tend to become iron overloaded until her mid to late 50s because of menstruation had protected her before that.
Do you want to speak on, I guess, heme protein, heme iron and the form of iron and how that isn't, that's easier to absorb, less, you could say, tightly regulated?
Yeah. So the heme iron from meat is much more readily absorbed than is the iron in plants. The body's pretty well able to regulate iron uptake from plants. But with the meat, it tends to overabsorb it about 4 or more times more than it should. Plus, the iron fortified stuff is just stupid. They'll just file iron shavings into a food and say, iron fortified, but that's not good for your health. The one thing, too, I wanted to mention is as they get older and they become iron overload, they start leaking iron into the blood and also into the cytoplasm and the mitochondria. And that's called free iron, where it's not bound to anything. And it's very dangerous. It's like having little fires all over the place. And in the blood, it can cycle back and forth between Fe2 plus, Fe3 plus. And in the blood, it can then function in two very bad ways. First of all, it can cause an amyloid change in the shape of the clotting protein, fibrinogen, and it'll go from being an alpha helix, like a slinky, a cylinder, to beta pleated sheet, flat. And once it goes beta pleated sheet, you can't stack up cylinders very easily, but beta pleated sheets, like a deck of cards, they'll stack up, and you'll cause these big molecules that'll precipitate out of solution and form clots. These clots are called dense matter deposits. They're refractory to lysis, meaning they're hard to dissolve, and they can travel around the blood and start plugging up small arteries. That's bad. Douglas Kell, the English PhD with Etheresia Pretorius, the South African PhD lady, they did the work on this. They deserve a Nobel Prize, but they'll never get it. All right. Anyway, so that amyloidogenic clotting is a problem, and iron does it just like bacterial endotoxins, LPS and LTA. All right, but then the second thing iron does is iron causes activation of bacteria, including dormant bacteria. So what I'm talking about is, imagine you had to walk, 20 miles, let's say 100 miles in the desert, okay? You wouldn't be able to do it because it's too hot and there's no water. So you go, screw it. I'm not going to try to walk the desert because there's no water. I would just die of thirst. I'm not going to do it. It's impossible. All right, well, that's the same thing in the human body, how it prevents infections. In order for a bacteria to replicate itself, it has to use iron to make some of its own enzymes to make a copy of itself. Well, if there's no iron available, it just doesn't have the resources to make a copy of itself. So screw it, it can't replicate. So that functions to prevent bacteria from growing. So our body sequesters iron. As a matter of fact, if we have an infection, our body will increase its sequestration of iron to prevent it from becoming accessible to that invading bacteria. So what I'm saying is as people get older, they start leaking iron into their blood, their cytoplasm, and their mitochondria, and they start getting more of these unwanted reactions. And they start getting activation of bacteria, because we have some bacteria that are sitting around dormant in our blood. They're called dormant bacteria. And you can reactivate them when you have more free iron, which is bad.
Yeah.
So the bottom line,
Yeah.
yeah. So what I do, by the way, is I donate blood. I initially donated half a unit. I got lightheaded afterwards. I didn't like it, so I'm not doing that again. But when I go for blood draws, I have them take off about 4 or 5 tubes every time. Let's say I go to get my B12 level checked. I go to check my, my cholesterol level or whatever it might be, my ferritin level. So ferritin is an indicator of serum ferritin, of the amount of free iron in your blood. Ideally, you want to be between 30 to 80. Mine initially, the normal range might be about 320, 360 at your hospital for serum ferritin, but a lot of the normal ranges are stupid. They're just based on fat sick Americans. The true normal range that you want on your serum ferritin is about 30 to 80, based on a lot of detailed study of that. So what I'm saying is I just gradually pull off about 4 or 5 tubes every time I go for a blood test. And so mine's currently at 110. I figured this out about 4 years ago, and I wish I had figured it out sooner. And I'm just getting it down gradually. I'll try to get it between 30 to 80. I'm working on it. But that's how I do it.
I haven't had a blood test in like years. 29 now. Do you recommend I get started on this?
Well, I don't think it's probably that big a deal, because you look very healthy. But if you were worried about your health, I would check it. If you're going to get your cholesterol level checked anyways, I would ask them, can you please check my serum ferritin?
My plan was never do a test for the rest of my life.
Well, I actually think it's best to avoid the system to the extent that you can. Because if you're feeling good, and you're doing everything right.
Why look for problems?
Why look for a problem? Right. You're more likely to have a false positive than a true positive.
Mm-hmm.
But, if the person was sick, they were having some problem, then I would say optimize everything and hope your problem goes away.
2 thoughts. So one, do you want to talk about, because I've met even like post-menopause women that still have quite low iron, ferritin. So do you want to speak on supplementation for iron and I guess balancing, having enough? But
yeah, it depends on how big their deficit is. If they have a real low iron, and also why is it? Some people are anemic, not because they're low in iron or diet or anything. They're anemic because they got ACD, anemia of chronic disease. So if they're making their blood thick by eating high-fat meals every day, and they're vasoconstricting themselves by eating tons of sodium, the body will sometimes compensate, and it'll lower the hematocrit, the amount of red blood cells they have, in order to compensate for them having thick blood. So what I'm trying to say is that's why, there's an old joke. McDougall said one time, if a person told me they had earwax, I would tell them to eat a starch-based diet. And it's a joke, but the point of the matter is fix your plumbing first, so to speak, by eating the right food.
Right.
And then if you still have a problem, then look for the secondary thing to do. But always fix that first, because a lot of times the problem could be related to that, and you can mess around doing a whole bunch of things, unnecessarily.
Do you want to throw a number out there for if your ferritin is this much, you should maybe consider supplementation?
Well, I say, where do you want your serum ferritin? You want it between 30 to 80. And the reason you want that is once you get it below 80, you're much less likely to have ferrous redox cycling in your blood and all the problems that go with that, like amyloid.
If it's 10, you're already eating starch-based diet.
You don't want it too low, though. The reason why you don't want it below 25 is when you get below 25, there's an increased incidence of what's called, your legs become active at night. You can get restless leg syndrome, RLS, and that can be discomforting, and that can make it hard for you to sleep. So you don't want to go below 30, because it's when you get below 25, not everybody, but some people have problems with that.
Okay, you've already covered this, so you don't have to answer it. But if you have other thoughts on it, I'll just ask it. What are some of the biggest misconceptions your colleagues, the public, or even researchers have regarding dementia and cognitive decline?
Yeah, what typically happens is they just go, oh, Alzheimer's, dementia, take this pill. There's nothing else you can do. Good luck. See you later. And come back, in a month. We'll check and see if you have any new problems, any side effects from the pill. So the whole thing's kind of a joke, okay? And then the other latest push is to give everybody omega-3s, but I think that's a bad idea, because omega-3s, number one, the fat you eat's the fat you wear. It makes you gain weight. Number two, it causes insulin resistance, predisposing you to worsening diabetes, and diabetes is associated with causing brain damage. So you're not going to win taking something that increases your diabetes risk. In addition, it suppresses the immune system. So you don't want to do that. That'll increase your risk of infections, increase your risk potentially of cancer. So obesogenic, diabetogenic, carcinogenic, and an immunosuppressant, I don't think I want that.
I had a second thought on iron, which I'm just going to add now. I talked to you about this, I think after our second or maybe after the first interview, but I have an idea. Cereal fortified with iron, and then you get the iron and the cereal stuck between your teeth, which is my sort of idea on why I think cereal and cavities kind of go together, at least in my past experience, which is interesting because, and I thought about this when I think you or someone had shared, maybe it was McDougall, that the egg white doesn't have any iron to it, so the bacteria can't get to the yolk, right? So.
Right. That's how you prevent the bacteria, because the bacteria can get through the egg shell, but they can never get to the yolk where the embryo is because there's no iron in the egg white.
Okay.
It's like a moat around a castle.
Any other comments, things you want to share regarding dementia, cognitive decline? Do you want to talk about Lewy body dementia? And maybe you even mention Parkinson's.
Well, that's like related to Parkinson's. You know, it's these, you got like these characteristic inclusion bodies that you can see at autopsy, but I don't think you're going to win the game there. What I would say about Parkinson's is you should know that you can get neurogenesis in the substantia nigra, the main part of the brain associated with Parkinson's disease in the midbrain there. And so exercise can really help Parkinson's patients a lot. Okay. Also, avoiding toxic chemicals like these toxic chemicals, some of these mitochondrial inhibitors, that MPTP chemical that causes Parkinson's, it's a mitochondrial inhibitor, causes Parkinson's disease. Same thing with TCE, trichloroethylene for dry cleaning, liquid paper. Stay away from all these chemicals. Stay away from VOCs, volatile organic chemicals, things that transition from a liquid to a solid, like paint, like liquid paper, and that give off toxic smells, like nail polish. Stay away from all that crap. It causes brain damage.
Do you know, not just even these, but other chemicals, like, do you know how, do they accumulate in the brain? Is their brain pretty good at flushing them?
Well, I give you another example. I'll give you other examples how people make themselves stupid. Like using deodorant. Okay, it's stupid to use deodorant. You walk in a room, you say, "Hey, how you doing?" You don't smell each other's armpits, and it's bad enough if you're rubbing deodorant in your armpit because it typically contains aluminum, which plugs up the sweat pores to prevent sweating. But you got shared lymphatics between the armpit and the breast, and that's why the incidence of breast cancer in the upper outer quadrant has increased from 30% to 60% if you compare it with the 1920s. Okay, but it's even worse to use spray-on deodorant. Because if you use spray-on deodorant, that means you're spraying aluminum in the air right next to your nose, and you're going to inhale some of that in your nose. The first cranial nerve, the olfactory nerve, goes straight back into the region of the hippocampus, okay? Because they think that the human brain evolved from something similar to a mouse olfactory cortex. The reason is, you know, your hand touches something. I'm going to touch this finger to this finger, this finger to this finger. It's a very precise, limited number of possibilities for the ham versus the olfactory cortex can freely associate one smell with anything. What I'm trying to say is there's more plasticity built into the olfactory cortex than other parts of the brain. And that's thought to be the reason why it evolved into the hippocampal memory center. And
which is why, like, if you're, I don't know, frogging through the fields or something, you have a smell, like, it can take you right back to childhood.
Right. You can remember a smell pretty well.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what I'm saying is inhaling aluminum, which is a potent neurotoxin, is stupid. So if every day you're spraying aluminum up to your brain, you're stupid. Okay. You're gonna cause cognitive impairment. And the same thing too, like a lot of people mean well and they'll spray like mosquito repellent on their kid. Okay. Well, that's got neurotoxicity to it. Anything that's neurotoxic to an animal is going to be neurotoxic to a human. Some people do that every day, and then they spray it in their backyard garden. Well, they're making themselves stupid. A lot of home gardeners.
What about eye drops?
What?
What about eye drops, like you mentioned?
Well, eye drops, it depends what type of eye drop. It depends what's in them.
Yeah, of course.
I know they used to store contact lenses with thimerosal, which contains mercury as a preservative. And that is neurotoxic to the brain. It's also toxic to the eyes. It increases the risk of cataracts. So what I'm basically saying is you don't want to inhale any neurotoxins. And knowing about toxicology is useful. High fructose corn syrup very often will contain mercury. They'll filter it through a chloralkali vat, and mercury often gets into it. And here's what's funny. The food companies would advertise high fructose corn syrup as a preservative, but they wouldn't say it's a preservative because of the mercury. Okay. And then I have a friend who's a molecular biologist, and he told me that
your friend. Yeah. So tell the story.
He has a friend who is a molecular biologist who published a paper showing that high fructose corn syrup is routinely contaminated by mercury. So guess what happened to his friend? You think they said, "Oh, that was a brilliant discovery, give him a salary, a raise"? No, the food company says, "Hey, this jerk on your staff is making our food look bad," and they had him fired. He got fired for that. So that's what I'm kind of. What? Well, he's a friend of a friend. I don't know what he's doing now. So, but what I'm trying to say is that kind of thing happens all the time. So the scientific literature is much more biased and controlled by industry than is widely recognized.
Okay, I think that's it. Thanks, Peter. Thank you for coming and
My
sharing
pleasure.
your supply-demand theory of dementia. It makes a lot of sense. I've been interested in this topic actually. I think right after high school, I started volunteering in palliative care, and it scared the shit out of me. Like I was absolutely terrified, and that was before I went to like the ward that was basically locked. Like it has a locked door, so people who have dementia can't walk out. And it was like I do not want to be in this situation. On that note, actually, maybe I'll try to keep this in the interview, but do you want to share some thoughts on people that have like the end stages of this disease? Because at least some of what I've seen out there is like, one, of course, you have the right to life and whatnot, but at a certain point, it feels like we're not doing these people a service anymore.
Right. A lot of that depends on the family, of course. But the point I would make is usually people who eat a plant-based diet, they don't get demented. They hardly ever get demented. And so they usually just die of old age. There comes a point when they just die in their sleep. And a lot of them are totally, fully mentally intact until the day they die. And that's what you want. You want your health span to be just about as long as your lifespan. So health span is the amount of time that you're healthy.
Yeah.
Lifespan is how long you actually live before you die. So you want your health span to be as equal to your lifespan as possible. And that's why you want to do all this stuff. So like I said, the average person I meet, by the time they're 55, they're fat, sick, and stupid. They're fat, they're sick, they're cognitively slow. And it doesn't have to be that way at all. Look at these vegans. A lot of these old vegans are still mentally sharp at 90. Caldwell Essenson's 90 years old. T. Colin Campbell's 90 years old.
Yeah, which is crazy to think about. 55 is like just over halfway, and you throw in the towel so quickly. Okay. All right. Thanks, Peter. Catch you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Okay.